Welcome back to another lecture in a series of lectures for the AP Environmental Science classroom. I'm Mr. Burley, and today's topic are forests, one of my favorite topics in environmental science. I hope that through this discussion you gain a respect and an appreciation for our nation's forests. Maybe you have some stories or some personal connections with forests as well. So let's dive right in and learn a little bit about this biome. Taking a look here at our planet, hopefully you can see that forests can be grouped into three general biomes. The largest forests in the world are those boreal or taiga forests of the northern latitudes, what you see in purple and blue there. Alright, those boreal forests are coniferous. They're the pine variety. They have cones as their seeds, but they are the largest forests of the world. The second largest forests of the world are our tropical rainforests, which are found mostly at tropical latitudes, equatorial latitudes. You see in the dark green and the lighter green there. That second largest forest biome in the world is being threatened at this point. And that's not good because of the amount of biodiversity that our tropical rainforests provide the planet and those ecological services. So, that's something to be concerned about. And then when you got the third largest forest in the world are our temperate deciduous forests. And that's our red and our yellows and oranges in this picture. So most of this discussion is going to be concentrated about the forests of the eastern part of the United States, and then you have the Pacific Northwest. And then you also have of Southern Europe, and then this part of the world here in Southeast Asia has a bit of temperate deciduous forest as well, and that becomes important. So let's dive right in and learn a little bit about our forests, focusing here in the United States. Forests are public lands of the United States. They're owned by the U.S. government and managed through the United States Forest Service. Alright, so it's the U.S. Forest Service that manages most of our public forested land here in the United States. And forests go under the principle of what's called multiple use, and we'll talk about that in another lecture on public lands. But multiple use means that you can use those lands for multiple uses. So in the case of forests, we use those lands for recreation, we use those forests for timber. Alright, so we can use the forests of the United States for multiple uses. And the goal of the United States Forest Service is to provide a balance between human needs and the ecosystem needs. So for example, humans need lumber, they need timber to build houses, to make paper. So the United States Forest Service needs to maintain a balance between those needs and the ecosystem's needs. The ecosystem needs the trees, a certain amount of biodiversity to be sustainable. So it's the job of the United States Forest Service to make sure all those needs are met and that there's a healthy balance. So take a look at the map, which shows you where most of our forests are in the United States. And you can quickly notice that most are found in the western half of the United States. Alright, there's a small bit here in northwestern Pennsylvania, which is the Allegheny National Forest. Okay, but these are the forests in our country that are managed by the United States Forest Service. Those public lands are to be preserved, maintained, and to be utilized for public use in a responsible way. Here's a picture of a giant redwood tree and what a forest should look like. If a forest is allowed to grow and allowed to mature into a climax forest. And this is what a forest should look like, left untouched in its natural state. And taking a look at the picture on the right hand side there, you see it's just a picture of some random person under the tree for scale. Again, these trees have adapted to have a very, very slow growth rate, which can give them up to 1,000 years of life. Or just another picture of what a forest should look like. Okay, so how does the National Forest Service manage these lands? Most of the forests are set aside and used for commercial timber operations. It's approximately 73% of our forests are used for timber. So think about that. Commercial logging companies are allowed into our national forests in exchange for royalty fees. All right, private companies use resources, they cut, they harvest, and they pay the National Forest Service a royalty fee to be able to do that. The problem is the idea of below-cost salvage cutting. All right, that means that when a private company comes to cut the trees, the fee that's charged to them is nowhere near what it costs for the National Forest Service to prepare for logging. So the National Forest Service will allow companies to come in, and the National Forest Service will actually build the roads for them. They do all the surveying, they take care of all the legal work, and the logging company just basically comes in and pays as little as $2.50 per tree to cut it down. So the problem is that it costs more to prepare for the cutting than the Forest Service actually makes for the cutting. The logging companies are making a profit of about $500 to $1,000 a tree, whereas the National Forest Service is very much losing out on this deal. It's a severe loss to the National Forest Service. All right, it's almost up to $500 million per year that the National Forest Service loses. You know, the natural question is, why sell trees for $2 a tree when there's such a profit for the logging companies? The same thing happens for rangelands, as we'll talk about in other public land lecture. But think about this: if our government charged more, if they charged the companies more money, then those companies would then have to charge us more for the wood. That increase would basically make things like houses unaffordable to many people. So by subsidizing the logging companies, that's how the government makes sure that housing is affordable for people. It keeps the costs down. So that's why our forests are being cut down for very cheap on the companies, because that translates to affordable housing for us. And that's how it works. Okay, so let's take a look here at this map. In the upper left is how much forest there was in the year 1620. If you notice, most of the East Coast, east of the Mississippi River, and even encroaching into the west, in the middle states, most of it was forests, and you have the Pacific Northwest. All right, as soon as we got here in 1620, we began to cut the forest down. All right, so if you look at time progressing here, you see the amount of forests being cut down, and very quickly, it only took about 200 years, and the East Coast was basically free of forests. There's these big patches here. You could see western migration, but the Pacific Northwest remained pretty much intact as of 1850. Continue through time here. We're looking at 1920. Most of our forests in the East Coast are basically gone, and in the Pacific Northwest you start seeing the forests deteriorate. And then we look at today. Basically all the forests are gone. Very few remain, even in the Pacific Northwest. Alright, so today it's less than 10% of the United States virgin forests that were here when we got here. Alright, and this is what's left today. When we talk about Brazil, or you hear about the deforestation going on in Brazil, we have to be very careful about what we say about rainforest deforestation, because we did the same thing here in the United States. We took our forests and we cut them down for the price of progress. So we have to be very careful what we say. Okay, so how did this happen? How does deforestation occur? Here's a picture of the Pacific Northwest, where deforestation was occurring as fast as 2 square miles per week, and you can see patches here in this picture that were clear cut. And when I say clear cut, what I mean is that everything is taken down. The land is basically cleared, free of everything. Here's a picture of, you can see roads that were built by the National Forest Service for the logging companies to come in and do their clear cutting. All right. Here's another picture of clear cutting. And what's interesting in this picture, let me get my pen. What's interesting in this picture, you can see one of the strategies for soil erosion, because when you clear cut an area, you're you're taking everything away, and one of the big problems is when you expose soil. When it rains, the soil and sediment can run off, and now you have soil erosion and you have sediment pollution. So one of the strategies is to take the trees and some of the debris that you're not using and basically make these barriers here. Alright, and you can see how they're staggered, and those are in an effort to control sediment runoff. There's a lot of problems when it comes to clear cutting. It's very destructive. Our technology is good. We can take a tree down and take the branches off in just a few seconds. This is a machine called a feller buncher. Alright, and this is the machine. It basically has a big giant saw at the bottom, and at the top here are clasps. It basically clamps the tree. The saw will cut the tree at the base, and then you can strip the branches off of it, and you get a perfectly cut and straight tree trunk. Alright, and then those trunks are then taken to paper mills for processing. But the feller buncher is our technology, and it is very good technology. Here you go. Here's some of those very straight and perfectly cut tree trunks. Alright, they're loaded on the trucks and taken for processing. There you go. Taken away for our use. So when you're going through this lecture like this and thinking about this and processing it yourself, think about your own paper use. Think about what you can do to reduce the amount of paper waste you produce. Right, this is one of the reasons why we need to recycle. If you care about our forests and the biodiversity and the plants and the animals, and even our cultural heritage, you'll reduce your paper use. So think about that and try and internalize these concepts and transfer them into your own personal lives. Okay, oh boy, here we go. This is where an endangered species known as the northern spotted owl. Alright, this guy is the friend of the forest. And the northern spotted owl has saved more forests than anyone. He is on the endangered species list, and by law we must protect its habitat, which happens to be old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. So we can use the northern spotted owl to protect old growth forests, and that's what we do. He becomes our friend of the forest. So as soon as an old growth forest that's known to be a habitat to this animal is threatened to be cut down, right, environmentalists come out and we use the northern spotted owl and the Endangered Species Act to politically stop the cutting. All right, so he is the best friend of the forest. Alright, so let's take a look at some more of these procedures that we use to cut down forests, that we use to cut forests. Alright, we don't have to cut all the trees down. We don't have to do that. That we already talked about is called clear cutting, and that is where you remove everything off the land and then you plant tree seedlings. So let's take a note here real quick. Alright, these are the procedures to cut. Alright, and there's a bunch of them. The first one is called clear cutting. And that's where you take everything off the land. There's a lot of environmental impacts to clear cutting. You increase soil erosion, which increases sediment pollution in our streams and our waterways, which leads to an increase in turbidity in those streams, the amount of sediment that is suspended in the stream as the stream moves. So an increase in turbidity is going to lead to fish kills. Okay, it carries bacteria downstream. Could be because now the bacteria has a boat to float on. Alright, it leads to mudslides, which are, there was just a mudslide in California that was caused by a clear cut. So we see this happen. It also, when you clear cut an area, it increases the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface. All right, and the more sunlight you have, you're going to have an increase in temperature. which is literally going to change the plant vegetation. Now you have a different microclimate in an area. So you're going to have a complete change in vegetation. So very quickly, just brainstorming this, the impacts of clear cutting, you can see that there's severe impacts to both land and aquatic systems. All right, so clear cutting, there's a lot of environmental impacts. So what do we do? All right, one of the solutions is to choose a different procedure to cut down or to log an area. All right, so what we can do is called selective cutting. So selective cutting is only pulling out the most valuable trees. We're leaving some of those trees there, which will reduce sediment pollution, it'll reduce soil erosion. All right, so tree roots hold soil. By leaving some trees there, it holds soil. All right, we're leaving some trees there so there's some shade, so those shade-tolerant seedlings can grow. All right, so we're not changing the species that are in the forest. All right, so there's a bunch of positives here. There's still impacts. Okay, this isn't a perfect solution. We still have to build roads for the logging companies. Okay, and those roads and the equipment that they bring in have impact. All right, so it's a better process. It's not a perfect solution, but selective cutting is a better process. Okay, here's a picture from out near Penn State University where they did a selective cut. As you see here, they took the more valuable trees, and the ones they left behind were those that aren't very valuable. So you can tell that this is not a fully functioning ecosystem. All right, like I said, it's a better process. It's not a perfect solution. Selective cutting. Here's a picture of the redwood forest in California, and you can tell that this was a selective cut a long time ago because you see in the foreground there's a lot of these big trees here, the redwoods. You see this redwood here and this redwood here about the same size, and everything else was cut around it. So these two trees here must have been left behind, and then seedlings were planted. So all these trees in the back here are all the same size. So they left a couple of these redwoods to grow, cut everything else, planted seedlings. So now you have just levels of the same ages of trees, if that makes sense. Let's take a look at another picture. Okay, here you go. You can tell an environment was either clear cut or experienced a selective cut by the age of the trees and what's called EvenAGED Stand and an uneven-age stand. In the even-age stand, all the trees are basically the same size. So you saw in the map picture a long time ago that all the forests were cut down by 1920 or by today. All the forests were cut down at one time. So the ones that have been replanted, if they were clear cut, when they were replanted, all the trees will be the same size. So you'll have what's called an even-age stand. All right, as opposed to if you're looking at a forest and there's an uneven-age stand, it means that it was either selective cut, so some of these larger ones were left, and then these middle-sized trees were then planted. It was either selective cut or not cut at all. All right, so you can look at a forest and make a decision if it's an even-age stand or an uneven-age stand. And if it's even-aged, it was clear-cut at one time. If it's uneven-aged, it might not have been touched, or it was selectively cut. All right, I like this picture. It's from an advertisement from Time magazine. Let's just read this quote. "Finally, a vehicle that can take you to the very places you're helping to preserve." Very nice image, very nice quote. But if you look and you're thinking about even-age stand forests, ones that have been clear cut, you notice that all these trees are the same size. And you might even notice that they're in lines and they're all about the same age. What's comical about this ad is that the picture shows an area that's not being preserved at all. It's what's called a tree plantation. Alright, these tree plantations are where trees are clear cut, and then they plant quick growing species, and then they clear cut it again. And you get this form of cycle where you have planting and harvesting and planting and harvesting. And tree plantations never really progress to a diverse, complex forest because they're usually the same type of tree. They have no ecological services to the life there, to the wildlife. They deplete the resources that are available, like the nutrients in the soil. It's basically a farm, a tree plantation. Alright, so the National Forest Service has to keep an eye on tree plantations and the impacts that they have on the overall health of our nation's forests. The United States Forest Service decided in the 1980s to place some regulations on tree plantations and to set some limits to biodiversity. But unfortunately, the laws aren't adequate, and there's a struggle to maintain biodiversity in our forests. So maybe it's time to take a look again at these laws and make sure that we are adequately protecting our forests and the biodiversity that we're trying to preserve. So going back to this ad, it's very misleading because this picture shows a tree plantation, something that's not biodiverse, something that is not a fully functioning ecosystem. It's basically a tree farm. Alright, so now it's time to talk about Smokey the Bear and learn a little bit about how the United States Forest Service manages forest fires. And Smokey the Bear, what is the famous quote that Smokey the Bear says? "Only you can prevent forest fires." The idea to prevent forest fires sounds good. It sounds like a good idea. And the United States Forest Service did a great job of suppressing fires. But we quickly learned that suppressing fires creates big problems for forests. So Smokey the Bear is probably the worst thing to ever happen to our nation's forests. That might be a little extreme, but it is definitely not a good thing to suppress forest fires. So if our forests don't burn, it's unnatural for the ecosystem. It's a natural thing for forests to burn. Think about succession. They're designed to burn every few years. Fire is actually good. An example is in Yellowstone National Park. In 1988, it was the driest year on record. 1/3 of the entire park burned. The National Forest Service got in big trouble from people. Alright, they allowed the fire to burn. They didn't stop it. There was total outrage of the amount of destruction that occurred from Yellowstone burning. From the U.S. Forest Service perspective, it had to burn. It was only years later that we found out the fire cleared out all the invasive species. It cleaned out all the debris on the forest floor. It allowed for the beginning of succession to occur again with the native plants that provides the food, the ecological services. They started to see the biodiversity increase of the forest. So fires are so natural to the process of succession that they're actually good things. And by fighting forest fires, it actually hurts the ecosystem. They concluded that the forest fires of 1988 provided many of the benefits to the ecosystem. So why did Smokey the Bear do the wrong thing? If you don't have a fire in a forest, tree branches die, small shrubs start to grow, invasive species come in, stuff builds up on the forest floor. The forest needs a cleansing, and that only comes through fire, through burning. All the stuff on the forest floor. It provides nutrients to the soil. It doesn't kill the tree. Most of our trees that grow are fire tolerant. It'll burn the outer layer of the bark, but the tree will survive. So fire becomes a literal cleansing of the forest. So the problem with Smokey the Bear is that he now allowed for the buildup of material. All right, it grew much higher than normal. It got big. Let me draw a little diagram here. Think about the Sikh forest. You saw a lot of branches laying around. And those tree branches lay on the ground. Small shrubs start to grow. All right, invasive species comes in, things build up, and you have more branches that fall down. Shrubs start to grow. You have all this debris that builds up. The forest needs a cleaning. So when you have a fire, the fire will burn all this stuff and literally clean, my eraser, clean all this stuff out. And it'll provide nutrients to the forest floor. The trees won't die. All right, it'll make it through just fine. So fires are actually good. Now, what happens if you don't have fires? This stuff will build up. The leaves and the branches will build up. Shrubs will grow. And it'll actually build too high. The debris of the forest will build up too high. And now, when you do have a fire, because the fire is actually a little higher, it'll catch the branches on fire, and you'll have a massive burning event. And all the tree will burn, and everything will burn, and it'll kill the entire tree. So Smokey didn't really prevent fires, he actually created larger ones. So we end up with huge fires now. All right, the worst fires were in 2003. This was the California wildfires of 2003. You can see the smoke from satellites. At any one time, there was about 20 to 30 fires going on. Alright, so now we have a different type of fire. We want to get rid of the weeds, the wood, the branches, the invasives at the bottom in this area of the forest. So if you have what's called a surface fire, it's different types of fires. A surface fire are the good ones. Right? These are the good ones. They burn low. They basically burn just the surface to clean all that stuff out and replace nutrients to the soil and so forth. Alright, but now, since we have too much stuff building up and the fires are getting into the canopy of the trees, we don't have surface fires anymore. We have what's called crown fires. Alright, and these crown fires is when too much material builds up, it gets into the understory or the canopy of the trees, the fire moves into the top of the trees, and it basically kills the entire tree. These are super destructive. They spread very quickly. Okay, they burn everything. Alright, this is the problem with suppressing fire. Too much stuff builds up, and now we're seeing these crown fires, which destroy large portions of our forests. And here you go. Our National Forest Service policy is to not put the fires out. They know it's going to cause massive destruction, but it will benefit the ecosystem. Alright, sometimes these things are so big that you can't put them out, so they only come in to protect landowners. Alright, so that becomes the goal of these firefighters. So when you hear the Forest Service is out fighting fires, what they're really doing is protecting landowners. So take a look at this picture here in the top left. Alright, you have a plane here fighting a forest fire, and you see the fire line way over here. So that plane is either a terrible aim, or they're spreading fire retardant on a property owner's property. So as the fire burns in this direction, this property right here has been doused with a flame retardant, and the fire will burn around it. So they're probably protecting a property owner there. So you have fire retardants being sprayed by aircraft. Another thing you can do here is create a break in the forest. They literally go in and clear out an area. So they'll clear out a part of the forest, and as the fire burns towards it, when it gets to that area that's cleared out, they can either stop it there or hope that it burns out. The problem with this technique is it doesn't usually work. Alright, these fires are too big and too hot, and they move so fast that the fire breaks don't usually work. Alright, in the top right here we have a crown fire where the canopy is burning and it's just causing massive amounts of damage. Okay, there's another picture of the crown fire, the canopy just burning. Another thing we can do is called a prescribed fire, a prescribed burn, and in the top left-hand corner you see that occurring. You have a gentleman here standing on the street with a flamethrower, and he's performing a prescribed burn. So he's going to start a fire here, and the fire is going to burn toward the forest fire so that they burn together and they burn out, and then there's nothing to burn. So a prescribed burn is another strategy that we use to protect landowners and to protect forests and land from destructive crown fires. One of the big problems, though, with prescribed burns and with fires in general is the wind. All right, if wind shifts, it could take a fire and move it even quicker, or take it into an area where that wasn't going to burn. Alright, prescribed burns are also good on a small scale with surface fires. Here's a surface fire prescribed burn. You can also call these controlled burns, because these gentlemen down here are controlling a surface fire, and what they're trying to do is intentionally clean out all the debris, the wood, the shrubs, maybe even an invasive species, and they're trying to get rid of the biomass to help the ecosystem, to get rid of that buildup. They typically do this in the spring when things are wet, so that it's easier to control the prescribed burn. Okay, here's just more pictures of controlled burns that are surface fires. Okay? Okay, so that's how we manage fires within fire management. And just to wrap up this little mini lecture here, just to recap, we talked a little bit about the lumber companies, how our forests are managed, trying to maintain a balance between the forest needs and the ecosystem needs and the people's needs. Alright, so we talked a little bit about lumber companies and how they cut the trees, their strategies of maintaining that balance, and a little bit about fire management and how forests need to burn, but there's the right way to do that, and that how it's beneficial to the ecosystem for them to have forest fires, and that fighting forest fires is a delicate process. Alright, and just to end here, hopefully you gain a little bit of an appreciation for this ecosystem and an appreciation for the loss of it. I think it's fascinating how substantial the depletion of our nation's forests was since colonization until today. We definitely don't have as many forests as we used to. The patches of trees that we do call forests are just small little islands of what once was great climax forest. And I want you to walk away with thoughts that we should protect and preserve our national heritage. Alright, forests are our cultural and ecological values of this country. Alright, so we should protect and preserve our nation's forests and understand how that ecosystem works. So hopefully you're a little bit more knowledgeable on this topic. I'll see you here next time in our series of lectures for the AP Environmental Science classroom. Thanks.